actually memes about this on Twitter constantly from right-wing people that I don't agree with most of the time, but are pretty funny, where they point out that like every new Netflix show has to have someone from an ethnic or culturally diverse background and at least one, if not more than one, gay character. Just like that's a rule. And it has, in fact, so this is a funny anecdote about how far the Overton window shifted on this. The Overton window shifted so far that gay people are actually massively overrepresented, in media now, relative to what percentage of the American population is gay. If you want to be entertained about this, you should Google two things. Google what percentage of the American population is gay. So it's a little less than 5%. And then Google what percentage do Americans think the population is gay. So in other words, what percentage of America does the public think is gay? And you'll get estimates anywhere from 25 to 50%. So they're so overrepresentative at this point, overrepresented that people think that a lot more of the country is gay than it is. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Learn Arena podcast. I am Trey Goff, the co-host of the podcast here and founder and CEO of Learn Arena. With me is Gabriel Mitchell. He is our director of content as well as our in-house philosopher. And today we are going to kick off a new series that Gabriel and I have been contemplating running for you guys, what I'm quite looking forward to. And the theme of the series is, put as simply as possible, discussing controversial ideas reasonably. So what we want to do here is go over a number of topics that are seen as hot button, controversial, like kind of beyond the pale for discussion. They're areas where people's brains go completely haywire when they try to talk about it. They're the site of much of the vitriol and anger and personal attacks that you find on social media. And what Gabriel and I want to demonstrate for you all and to show is that it's possible to discuss these very complex, touchy, emotional subjects from an objective point of view, with rationality, with nuance, and in a way that seeks to discover the ground truth, especially if you have a good faith conversation partner like we do with Gabriel and I. And you can get at truth even if you both disagree starting out, and even if the topic is hard to kind of wrap your mind around and crosses ideological boundaries or philosophical or religious boundaries. So we're going to touch basically every hot button topic you can think of that might fit into that category. We're going to talk about abortion. We'll talk about IQ. We'll talk about racism in America. We'll talk about feminism. We're going to touch all sorts of fun stuff. So we'll have a lot of exciting content for you guys coming in the next several weeks as we flesh these ideas out. Today's episode, however, is not about any one specific concept, but we first wanted to lay the groundwork for you all of what it is that we're going to be doing, what it is that we're going to be discussing, and why it's why it's important in the details there. And I want to start a little bit talking about why me and Gabriel even thought this was a good idea in the first place, which is we have noticed, even in the podcast space of seemingly rational people, there is a continued cultural shift towards political radicalism. And Gabriel had a really good perspective on this. Gabriel, will you kind of describe the problem here, if you will, that we're looking to address and to help ameliorate somewhat with this series?
Yeah, I mean, the surface level problem is people are just too darn angry. Everyone's so invested and aggressive about it. And I can sort of understand why. I mean, we're talking about ideas, and ideas matter a lot. But for whatever reason, in our current day world, we've gotten into this pretty radical sort of split. Everyone's going off into their very radical tribes. I've noticed, like if you go and talk to, say, Gen Zers, or I guess now Gen Alpha, none of them have moderate political convictions. Everyone is a radical. They're either explicitly a communist or explicitly libertarian or explicitly a fascist. The world of classic moderate Republican and classic moderate Democrat working together to solve problems does not exist anymore. Social media could be to blame. It does have an effect of pushing us into kind of different bubbles. And it could just be, we live in the end times of the American civilization or something like that. And this is just a natural progression of how civilizations grow. And so it's hard to say exactly what the cause is, but I'm definitely noticing all these things are correlated and connected. And it's created a context where friendly political conversation is basically non-existent. It is rare that you find communities as good as, say, our Discord, where people can have very rational, friendly conversations. It is very rare to see communities like that, and I really treasure what we have there, and I am desperate to protect it and make sure it does not go haywire.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you want to engage in this kind of conversation that we're going to have about controversial issues, the Learn Arena Discord is genuinely the best place for that. Now, obviously, we're a little biased, but I mean, Gabriel and I heavily moderate it. So, like, we don't let people do personal attacks. We don't let people be rude. We heavily enforce the kind of rules of decorum and rules of debate. So, if you want a place where the rules are actually enforced, unlike Twitter or elsewhere, you can come to the Learn Arena Discord. I'll just add, Gabriel, that I think this increased polarization and political radicalism is definitely a thing. First of all, what's funny is you could even see this within my own family. So my brother is a couple years younger than me, and we're right at the generational divide. I'm like one of the last millennials, and he's one of the first Gen Zers. And I started out in high school, right? Your classic conservative Republican, moved my way to libertarian, and then ended up at kind of an anarcho-capitalist worldview with some modifications. And my brother like started where I ended. So like in towards the end of high school, him and his friends were already like extremely right wing, to the point where they like I even in my extreme openness to experience, like their memes, their jokes, the stuff they talk about politically are even beyond what I would consider like within the Overton window. So within my own family, I've seen this too. It's like with each generation, the radicalization increases. And I think a big part of that is the internet, actually. So Balaji Srinivasan, who's a technologist and a kind of a public intellectual, has a hypothesis and explanation for this that I find quite attractive, which is that the internet drastically increases variance on every spectrum that can have variance, right? So with the internet, you can have people who make no money on the internet, and you can create 100 billionaires thanks to the internet, right? Look at Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Thanks to the internet, you can have people who make millions of dollars a year and go viral doing nothing more than building cool things out of wood or recording entertaining videos, and people that get one or two views after toiling away at it for years, right? The internet just increases the variance of everything, the likelihood that you're going to encounter the extremes of anything, because it's a free and open means of communication. Now, what that means is, unfortunately, you can have people start clustering, right, around various extreme poles of whatever spectrum it is, especially political spectrums, and they create echo chambers. They discover the even more radical ideas they would have never found and kind of organically without the internet. And it creates this self-reinforcing feedback loop of ever increasing radicalization and polarization, because the internet increases variance, both for good and for ill. That means there's much higher upside on the internet, but also much higher downside, right? You can lose your entire fortune in 30 seconds day trading crypto options, right? Or you can make $1 million in a day trading crypto options. So the internet drastically increases variance.
Yeah, I think a lot about a conversation we once had with. There's a younger guy on our staff who's an intern. I don't know if I should be naming him just because he's an intern, but and I remember all of us, like you and I, were reminiscing about the '90s, and like it's not that you and I were born in the '80s and we like super lived through the '90s, but being born in the '90s, we still have some connection to it and understand it culturally. And we were reminiscing about and really started talking about the sort of theoretical '90s where there was a peak of like American consensus and like unity. And I remember talking to our friend, and he was saying like, I was born 2000s. I have never experienced this ever. This is super weird. I have no clue what you're talking about. I can't even imagine it. And that was pretty shocking to me. And I again, can't help but feel the internet has a big part of this. And so a lot of what we're talking about, of course, connects to what we refer to as the Overton window. Do you want to kind of dive into that and let everyone know what that is?
Yeah, I'll discuss this briefly. So the Overton window, which as an aside, this is really funny. This think tank called the Mackinac Center for Public Policy has copyrighted this concept from political science. It's just like a political science term, which is I find hilarious that they copyrighted an academic term. In any event, the Overton window refers to the idea that there is a window, right? A space within which there are allowable public opinions. The Overton window was initially developed with regard to politics. So the initial conception of the Overton window was there's like a box, basically, within which you're allowed to propose ideas. So in the 1990s, this was things like we should reduce the income. I'll use the income tax as an example. Within the Overton window, even up to today, really, for this particular thing, it would be beyond the pale, like not even worth considering. You can't even discuss the idea of eliminating the income tax entirely, right? It's more, should we increase the income tax by 10% at the top income earners, or should we decrease it by 10% across the board, right? But the idea that either the income tax should be 90% on incomes above $1 million, or the idea that the income tax should be 0% for anyone, are both outside of the Overton window, meaning they are beyond what is considered socially and culturally acceptable to discuss. Now, this was originally created in the context of political possibility, right? So, in effect, the political outcomes that you can strive for in democratic governance are within that box. Now, the thing is, this Overton window concept is accurately describes the world, but applies to a lot more than politics. So I have a few examples I was going to kind of walk us through of ideas that have shifted the Overton window significantly along a number of spectrums and kind of changed the shape of the Overton window. But before I do that, do you want to add anything, Gabriel, on this concept of the Overton window and why it's important before we dive into kind of describing it in more detail?
It's definitely interesting because this article that you and I are kind of peeking at as we're talking, one of the examples they give is homeschool regulation. This is something I've heard a lot about, and like I live in a world right now where homeschooling is pretty normal, and I have all these like homeschool advocates who the fight isn't homeschool needs to be legal. The fight is it's better than public school. You should do it. But as I talk to them, especially the older ones, they tell me that just 20 years ago, the fight was homeschooling should be legal at all, and that's wild. That's wild. It's crazy. It's really intense to see that kind of shift and talk to people who've experienced it. I think the Overton window also should be something to keep in mind if you care about social change, because you have to frame the things that you're talking about within that context, as well as recognizing that if you are right, or at least if you're persuasive, you can shift that window. It is not a static thing. It is forever evolving and something that you can influence by being persuasive. Those are the two main things that kind of came to mind for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me give a few examples to really concretize this for people, right? So I'll just kind of rapid fire a few. One example of something, a topic on which the Overton window drastically shifted in the last 25 years or so is homosexuality and gay marriage. If you look at the late 1980s, early 1990s, gay people were not accepted socially and culturally. There were hardly any kind of gay public figures. There were very few. There was very little representation of gay figures within mass media. Think movies, TV shows, books, plays, that sort of stuff. And it was beyond the pale to even consider making it legal for gay people to get married. That was a complete non-starter. It was outside of the Overton window. Now, after a very consistent public advocacy and persuasive public advocacy campaign by gay rights activists, culminated in 2010 with the Obergefell v. Hodges decision to legalize gay marriage in all 50 states in the United States. So that's an example of something where the Overton window was massively shifted. The idea of gay people should be able to get married, that basic idea, was very far outside the left-hand side of the Overton window for the entirety of American and developed country culture until 2010, at which point the tide finally shifted. This became within the Overton window, and it was legalized. And now this is so squarely within the Overton window that it's almost weird to even think about, especially for younger people, to Gabriel's point. It's weird to even think about a time when gay marriage and even the much more radical kind of critical theory, queer theory, et cetera, wasn't just super mainstream, right? Like we are very used to seeing a new TV show. There's actually memes about this on Twitter constantly from right-wing people that I don't agree with most of the time, but are pretty funny, where they point out that like every new Netflix show has to have someone from an ethnic or culturally diverse background and at least one, if not more than one, gay character. Just like that's a rule. And it has, in fact, this is a funny anecdote about how far the Overton window shifted on this. The Overton window shifted so far that gay people are actually massively overrepresented, in media now, relative to what percentage of the American population is gay. If you want to be entertained about this, you should Google two things. Google what percentage of the American population is gay. So it's a little less than 5%. And then Google what percentage do Americans think the population is gay. So in other words, what percentage of America does the public think is gay? And you'll get estimates anywhere from 25 to 50%. So they're so overrepresentative at this point, overrepresented that people think that a lot more of the country is gay than it is. Another example of this, and I'll spend a little less time on this one because this one's pretty straightforward, is the decline in the dominance of the Christian religion in the United States. So it used to be outside the Overton window for like a public official or anyone really to publicly proclaim anything other than Christianity or some variant of Christianity. Whereas now it is perfectly acceptable for public figures, and in fact, it's normal and is expected now for public figures to either be atheist, agnostic, or like capital S spiritual, right? And it is now, in fact, a much more of a surprise if they are Christian. For example, Chris Pratt has gotten a famous actor, has gotten in a lot of heat for his outspoken Christianity in press tours for his movies, which is a crazy juxtaposition because you go back to even the 1990s, right? 2 decades ago, then it was very normal for actors, actresses, public officials to be very outspoken Christians. And then a final example of this, and one that makes me a little more upset, is nuclear energy and atomic energy. Back in the I'm reading a book about this right now called Conservative Futurism. I'm going to give you some cliff notes on this later, Gabriel. I think it might be worth discussion on the show even. But in the book, they talk a lot about the history of nuclear energy, right? Nuclear energy is a effectively infinite, carbon neutral, very safe, very environmentally friendly form of energy generation. And in fact, in a single decade, in the 1950s, we built literally hundreds of nuclear reactors around the US. We got to around 25% of the American power generation was coming from nuclear carbon neutral sources. And then Chernobyl happened, 3 Mile Island happened. And when those happened, and you had the creation of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 1971, there has not been a single new nuclear reactor approved by the NRC until 2022. They finally approved one SMR, one small modular reactor, a very tiny test concept. So that's another example of, you bring up nuclear power in culture now, and you see even the depictions in movies, whatever. It's always scary things, right? It's like that HBO series about Chernobyl. It's always, oh, what if they explode? It's almost was be outside of the Overton window completely. And the proof of this is in the NRC, right? Not approving a single nuclear reactor for over 50 years once they were instituted. It was more like the correct name for it would be the Anti-Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because they quite literally just stopped nuclear progress in its tracks, much to the detriment of American society at large. So those are a few examples of how the Overton window is very flexible and can shift quite drastically in a fairly short period of time. Gabriel, do you have some other kind of examples of this?
Yeah, I was mentioning kind of the homeschooling one. I think that's a pretty big one. It's also interesting just how much like political radicalism in general is so mainstream. It's very weird how normal it is to call yourself a communist, like online. Because I mean, communism is a very radical idea. It's a very extreme sort of ideology, but it's treated very casually among people, and even kids calling themselves fascists and stuff. Like, most of them are just being dumb or being edgy, but like the idea that you can kind of be a teenager, say something like, "Yeah, I'm a fascist," and it's just sort of normal to say. It doesn't even make you second guess what you're saying is very interesting, and it really demonstrates certain cultural shifts that we've had. But I mean, all sorts of stuff, like even uh, there's a lot of topics we're going to be discussing coming up, things like abortion, things like controversial kind of topics like that, and even abortion itself has gone through different Overton shifts. Within just the past few years, there was certain repeals that happened, and that's pretty major. I mean, that shows like a pretty large kind of cultural shift in a particular direction that maybe was that way in the 90s, then early 2000s. Everyone was pro-abortion, and now everyone's kind of slowly becoming a bit more anti-abortion, and just various shifts. But we could sit here and list off of hundreds and hundreds of examples, but I don't know if it would be too productive.
Yeah, I think the point should be clear by now. The only other point I'll add, which is a very good one you just made, Gabriel, which is that the Overton window is not just one static shape. Not only does the window itself move, right? So let me give an example of the window itself moving. We'll take homeschooling again. The homeschooling window, Overton window, the whole window shifted. It is now completely beyond the pale to talk about banning homeschooling, when in fact it was legally banned for decades. And it is now perfectly normal to talk about homeschooling. And in fact, it is normal, although on the edge of the Overton window, to claim with a straight face and completely seriously that homeschooling is just objectively better than traditional formal schooling, public or private, in any way. Right? So that Overton window didn't change shape, more or less. It just completely moved down the spectrum, such that things that used to be in it and normal are now outside of it, and things that used to be way too radical for it are now squarely within the Overton window of homeschooling. But Gabriel made another great point, which is that the window itself can expand drastically as well. So the breadth of political ideologies that one can claim to hew to publicly on social media, in friend groups, whatever, is now drastically larger. Like that window didn't shift in either direction. It just hugely expanded. You have people like my good friend Michael Malice, who goes on Joe Rogan's podcast a lot, goes on Fox News a lot, very ardent, self-avowed anarchist, right? Anarcho-capitalist. And then you have self-avowed communists that go on these mainstream outlets and have millions of followers, right? And you have kind of the environmental movement has seen a very similar thing, right? Where the window just expanded drastically in both directions. You have people that think environmentalism in and of itself is evil, which I think I pretty much fall into it by this point. And then you have degrowth environmentalists who think, in fact, that the natural environment is more important than humans, and we should reduce humans' footprint on the entire world, right? So the window can change shape as well as shift in one direction or the other without changing shape.
Oh, I
Now,
also forgive me for interrupting you, but I really want to inject this that
please.
Not only everything you said is true, but also the window is different in different contexts. So the Overton window in a college campus is different than the Overton window in the Learn Arena office or something like that. You know, that's a
point.
Very important extra thing to keep in mind.
That's exactly right. The Overton window is contextual. And you can demonstrate this probably in your own personal life. I want you to think about the types of political opinions you would float at your Thanksgiving dinner and the types of political opinions you would float while you're out hanging out with your group of closest friends. It's going to be two drastically different Overton windows. One's going to be a lot smaller than the other. That's a great point, Gabriel. Now, you may be asking yourself at this point, like, okay, got it, but why does this matter for discussion of controversial topics? And it matters because what is controversial is, in effect, another way to define what is controversial is what is outside of the Overton window. That's why this concept is so important for understanding controversy. But let's focus on controversy for a second. So again, the next several episodes we'll be doing are on, quote, controversial subjects. But what does controversial mean? Like, what constitutes a controversial claim, and who gets to stipulate what is considered controversial? So, Gabriel, do you want to talk a little bit about how social media plays into this and some of the answers to those questions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so one plausible answer, building off of what we talked about so far, is that controversy means things on the edge of the Overton window. That could be one way to define it. There's other things we'll dive into. And as mentioned, social media and the internet has created this sort of amplification of political divisions. And so we're like saying something like, here's a controversial claim that I think is absolutely untrue. The Jews are behind COVID-19 or something like that, right? Very like radical, controversial, offensive, nonsensical claim. But there are bubbles on the internet where you say that and no one bats an eye. Where everyone's like, well, you're right, but also the earth is flat. And they like and they kind of play off of each other. And so you got to understand that controversial, just like the Overton window, is contextual. Very contextual. But how we think of controversy has really been amplified, has really shifted a lot with social media, because we're also kind of desensitized to a lot of things. From a child, you're exposed, if your child is on the internet, you're exposed to a lot of very strange, controversial ideas. Everything from like Holocaust denial to people talking about killing the landlords to all sorts of very extreme, radical sort of positions. And we become somewhat desensitized to these things, even though 100 years ago, like some of these positions would have put you in jail just for saying it, you know, or at least put you on some sort of watch list. And so that's kind of off the top of my head how I've been thinking about how social media is related to these ideas around controversy. But it's still very much something I'm kind of fleshing out, and I'm hoping this conversation will give me a deeper understanding of.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with everything you just said, first of all. You're exactly right. And what's controversial, again, just like because it's so tightly related to the Overton window, what's controversial in one context is perfectly acceptable in another, and vice versa. We're, for the most part, talking about controversy in terms of what most people, say like your average American, would consider a controversial topic. By that, I mean the kind of mass American Overton window, right? So I'm going to take a bit of an aside here, Gabriel. Let's talk about some philosophy a little bit. And again, as we've discussed previously, philosophy is important for a number of reasons, and it directly touches on this topic. If you want to learn more about kind of how to think logically through philosophy and through especially some of the considerations of both ethics and logic I'm about to go through, we have courses on both of those things on Learn Arena. I will include links to both of them. So those two courses will help you understand the conversation we're about to have a lot more deeply. But first, I want to dive into a thinker who I despise for his political prognostications and the things he's done to mass culture, but talked about this a lot and made some interesting points, which is Michel Foucault. So Michel Foucault was a French philosopher who had a bizarre conception, in my opinion, bizarre, but really interesting conception of metaphysics that revolved around language. So Foucault's metaphysical view as it relates to language and controversy was that language in and of itself literally shapes reality. Okay. So his view was reality is constituted by, instead of what Gabriel and I have talked about with objectivism, for example, that have different metaphysical views of reality. Foucault's metaphysical view of reality is that reality is constituted by and shaped by what we can describe in language. And he has a point here, okay? Insofar as if you have a topic, a thing that is impossible to describe in words, then it, for all intents and purposes, from Foucault's perspective, does not exist because you cannot describe it and you cannot convey it to others, right? So this Foucault perspective is very subjectivist. It is a view of reality that does not take into account an objective reality, a base reality at all. And he has a point insofar as if you can't describe something in language, it is indeed very hard to get at, to do anything with, right? Now, Gabriel and I would both say, I think, and I don't want to speak for Gabriel here, but at least I'll definitely say, he's right that it matters for communication, but not for the ground reality, right? So if there's a concept that you cannot describe in language adequately, that does not mean the concept or the thing does not exist. That just means the language is inadequate to describe it, and it means nothing more than that. That there is an objective reality under there, irrespective of whether or not you can describe it very well. Now, Foucault expands upon this a little bit with this concept of what he calls discourse, right? So in the Foucault framework, discourse is effectively it's a framework of structures of thought and experience and social reality that describes how power relations and power dynamics are created between people. Now, I will readily admit I haven't read Foucault since college, and I did a brief kind of refresher right before this with GPT-4, to kind of jog my memory some. But the core of the idea of discourse is that it is a discourse, meaning the rules around what you can say and how you say it, the particular words you use, are specific to a particular sociocultural context, and they are a way to kind of control or shape behavior without having to resort to traditional forms of power like overt violence, right? We typically associate violence at the end of the day with power and power with violence. Foucault's point was that actually there's an entire other form of power wrapped up in this concept of discourse, and that form of power is a social power. If you, like let's say me and Gabriel right now, are able to, with a magic wand, stipulate the precise definition of words based on our worldview, and further, what words anyone discussing that topic is allowed to use or not use, then we have just very tightly constrained the kind of discussion space and the realities that can be constructed from the Foucault point of view around that particular topic, right? So I bring this up. This may seem a bit abstract, but it's really important to understand because I think there is, while I think Foucault was wrong about many things, he did have a fantastic insight here about how the specific use of language and how we use it in specific sociocultural contexts shape and guide what is considered legitimate in those contexts, or to frame it differently, what is within the Overton window of that context and what is not, and how we think about what is controversial and what is not. So in other words, from a Foucaultian perspective, if you get to decide, if your group, your tribe, whatever, gets to decide what is considered controversial for the purposes of this discussion, then you inherently have power over everyone else who discusses that particular thing. So let me pause there, Gabriel. I want to get your reaction to that, thoughts on that. Obviously, you and I both very much disagree with the metaphysics here, but besides the metaphysics, the applied philosophy of language here, I think, is very interesting.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, there's a very concrete example you can see right now in our culture, and that's debate around the definition of racism. There's one definition that, in my humble opinion, is a bit more intuitive, which is simply racism is devaluing someone based off their ethnicity, or viewing one ethnicity as better, or discriminatory actions based around ethnicity. There's another definition that is very popular among kind of the university liberal type, where racism is privilege plus power, or discrimination plus privilege plus power, or whatever. And it's this idea that and from this definition, as a result, if someone who is of, say, African descent discriminates against someone who's white, perhaps creating like an Africans only space, that from this model, that action is not racist because that person is not acting from a place of power and privilege, even if they might technically be in this specific in the momentary context. But as the broad meta-analysis, they're not actually privileged, and so it's just discrimination, not racism. Versus the other definition that says, well, this is actually racism, even if there's maybe some context to justify this potentially discriminatory act, it is still technically definitionally racism. So this is a really good example because from the power and privilege model, we create a context where certain actions that may be otherwise considered racist are now non-controversial and acceptable from that model. And you can use that to push towards certain desired political outcomes. Discriminating against, say, Asians in the context of Harvard admissions might not be considered racist if it's done in favor of some other minority group that is more disadvantaged or something like that. And so it has these pretty radical political implications, where on the other hand, if you define racism as just any sort of racial ethnicity-based discrimination, then that sort of discrimination against Asians in Harvard admission processes would be considered racist, and by most standards, racism is immoral, and so therefore immoral, so we shouldn't do it. And that is such a perfect example of this exact sort of thing, that the way in which you define things influences the popular discussion and influences what you consider moral and who you could think should be in power and what sort of laws are passed. And so that's to me is the most concrete example I can think of this playing out in reality.
That is a perfect example, and I'll just play off of that to describe a little further. So Foucault also talks about, with relation to this, what he calls discursive formations. So let's use the racism example to flesh out what he means by this. What he means by discursive formations is really just like who gets to set the rules around the conversation and what those rules are. So again, the racism discussion is a perfect example here. The current group, right, that is setting the discursive formation around racism is kind of the left-leaning academics and journalists at major media outlets, as well as the people that produce content at places like Netflix and Amazon Prime and or Prime Video and other places, that all kind of have settled on this power plus privilege definition of racism. And because they are in effect setting the rules of this discussion, it is now considered against the rules, right, beyond the pale, to attack the very idea of diversity itself, right? So like there's a good conversation we can have, and Gabriel and I will have. One of the episodes is going to be about racism as it relates to the very concept of diversity itself. Like it is an open question, logically, and from a philosophical perspective, if diversity, as construed by the current mainstream opinion, is in and of itself an inherent good, or if it has trade-offs, if it has pros and cons, depending on the context and how it's applied. But it is beyond the Overton window right now to even challenge the very idea of diversity equals good in and of itself, precisely because, as Gabriel pointed out, the group that is currently doing the discursive formations around this topic has deemed that to be so, and they will socially and culturally ostracize and punish you for violating these rules of discussion. So while Foucault might have been way off on metaphysics, he had some really good points in more like kind of applied philosophy of language. Now, another philosopher I want to mention briefly on this topic that also can help us understand what controversy means, what controversial means, is a philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. So he was also a famous philosopher of language, effectively. And what kind of era of his life's work you focus on will determine kind of what Wittgensteinian take you get on language. But I like to think of Wittgenstein's contribution to this conversation and to this concept is what I call Wittgensteinian terminological debates, right? So Wittgenstein pointed out that at the end of the day, all public debate, all public discourse ends up devolving to terminological debate. And what he meant by that was quite literally the nuts and bolts of what's the definition of words. This racism example is a great example. The entire public debate around race in America right now effectively is driven by and is caused by, at its root and almost exclusively, the definition of the singular word racism and the definition of that concept. So Wittgenstein, his idea was a little more simple in many respects, which was just that conversation, language, right, is kind of a form of life, and it's a game that we are constantly playing, where there's a constant tug of war between different factions that have different beliefs and different groups and different concepts of the definitions of specific terms. So you end up in these Wittgensteinian terminological kind of holes. And one of my favorite examples of this, actually, which Gabriel and I will also do an episode on while we're going through controversial stuff, is free will and consciousness, right? Both of those words, either one, I'll take both of them real quick. It is almost impossible to arrive on a definition of consciousness that even Gabriel and I will both agree, yes, that is a good definition of consciousness. The same goes for free will. It is very hard to describe exactly what that is. So to debate consciousness, right? Like to debate if AIs are conscious, for example, or to debate, do humans have free will or is free will an illusion? When we have that discussion here on the podcast, which we're going to do, you'll see when we have that conversation that 80% of it is going to be spent discussing the terminological definitions and the operational definitions of free will and of consciousness. And another point Wittgenstein made is that kind of he who gets to determine the definitions gets to determine what a concept means, and therefore kind of wins the public discourse, right? Who sets the definitions wins, basically. And he didn't mean this in a dictionary sense, because often dictionary definitions are quite out of sync with what a word actually means. But this also applies to other things besides just controversy, right? So like the word literally is a great example of this. To take a more benign example, the word literally no longer means literally. People will often use literally as a kind of emphatic, right? They'll say, dude, I literally could not breathe. I was laughing so hard. Well, that's probably not the case. You probably weren't literally laughing so hard that you couldn't breathe, but you're trying to convey emphatically that something was really funny. So literally now means almost the opposite of what it will mean if you look it up in the dictionary, which is like, it means something is literal and actually happened as I'm describing it. So I think Wittgenstein and Foucault taken together can help us arrive at a definition of controversy and what is controversial, which is something like either from a Foucaultian perspective, right? To wrap a bow around this, then I want your response to this, Gabriel. Kind of a Foucaultian perspective would be that which is controversial is that which is outside of the rules set by those who are forming the discourse. And for Wittgenstein, that which is controversial would be that which is beyond or outside of the current definitions of the terms that language currently represents through the ever-evolving game of language and terminological specificity. So with that, I'll pause, Gabriel. I want to hear your thoughts on those two.
Yeah, the biggest weakness with the Foucault approach, other than the kind of implied metaphysics, is that it often requires sort of intentionality. It's almost like it's almost when you read it and you think about how he's thinking about language, you almost imagine a conspiracy of people getting together to decide rights are defined as X, and we're doing this so that we can take your stuff or something. But Wittgenstein correctly, I think, identifies it as more of an emergent, sort of decentralized kind of process. And the debate here isn't about like, how do we define words? The debate is simply like acknowledging that there is a social aspect to these word games that are happening. Whether or not there are actual objective definitive definitions is not as important to what we're getting at here. And it is quite clear to me that there is a game going on. And if you want to make progress, you need to win that game, or at least you need to set the rules with your debate partner as early as possible. You need to find agreement as soon as you can so that you can sort of move forward. Because without that, you're going to be talking past each other. And you might have the right definition in some metaphysical objective sense. You may very well have it, but it doesn't matter if the person you're talking to hasn't found a way to be open-minded and hear what you're saying. So you need to kind of, when you're engaging people, be very, very cautious around definitions and be very careful about asking questions like, oh, wait, you're saying this. What label are you using for that? What exactly do you mean when you use this word? Because I'm not just going to assume it. I'm going to listen to you exactly. And I might clarify, oh, well, historically, actually, philosophers have meant this. But I need to first get a sense of what you mean when you say the thing so that we can have those conversations and move forward. And so there's a lot of strengths in both of these analyses. And I think it's right for us to define controversy as roughly something along the lines of the things outside of the Overton window, or at least on the edges of it. The things that are on the edges of socially accepted understanding of terms, or something along those lines.
Absolutely. I think that's a good kind of summary of that discussion of controversy. Now, I want to move on to, for our final section here, kind of extending this discussion of controversy as it relates to the Overton window and put it in a kind of modern mainstream context. Okay. So as Gabriel and I walk through a number of these topics, we're going to inevitably have to confront in a number of ways conspiracies that people have around some of these ideas. Okay. Now, conspiracy, again, to use our philosopher kind of lens here, is a word often that people will use to just describe something that they want to kind of throw out of hand, that it's silly. Like classic examples of conspiracy theories, right? And I'm not passing judgment on any of these per se or saying I believe them or not. Just examples of them are like 9/11 was an inside job, the moon landing was fake, the earth is flat. Like these are all kind of conspiracy theories, right? Um, Now, the question we need to ask ourselves as it relates to controversy and conspiracy is a similar one to controversy, actually, which is like what constitutes a conspiracy, right? Um, because we'll end up discussing things that some people may consider a conspiracy and some people may consider like, yeah, this is just obviously a fact. And that's because we have differing cultural conceptions around what the word conspiracy even means and when that's kind of a helpful conceptual frame to look at something through. So, Gabriel, how do you think about like the concept of conspiracy as it relates to the Overton window?
So as you've mentioned, conspiracy can be used in a lot of different ways, and it is often used almost as a derogatory sort of insult towards an idea, like, oh, that's just a conspiracy. But literally, a conspiracy is a term we use in, say, criminal law to refer to more than one person, so multiple people, two or more, getting together to do something. In the context of criminal law, it'd be getting together to commit a crime. And that's really all a conspiracy is. It may also involve, say, a level of secrecy or something like that. But in some sense, like a company is a conspiracy. You and I are together conspiring to change the world. And we meet in secret signal chats to discuss our plans for how we can change the world. So in some sense, that's a conspiracy. But a conspiracy theory seems to usually refer to kind of larger scale conspiracies that have large sort of social and political impacts. So believing that 9/11 was an inside job, which of course is silly because the planes came from the outside, would be a conspiracy theory in the sense of you believe that a group of people, perhaps George Bush or perhaps the CIA, got together to decide a thing would happen. In this case, an extreme disaster that led to the deaths of many people. And you would assert that there was some conspiring. There was a group of people who got together to come up with this thing, and so now you have a theory. Probably hypothesis might be a better word than theory, but you have this conspiracy hypothesis or the conspiracy theory that these people got together to do this thing to cause the harm, and it's all done in secrecy. And your conspiracy theory is now in tension with what we might call the mainstream narrative or something like that. And that's in part of what makes it controversial, is that it is in tension with what we're calling the mainstream narrative, which in these sense just means the things that are within the Overton window of understanding and describing the event. And so the 9/11 conspiracy theorist is on the edge of that Overton window and not in line with the sort of mainstream beliefs.
Absolutely. I think that's a great kind of using an example to describe exactly what we mean by conspiracy theory here. Now, here's why this is super important, especially since COVID, this rapidly accelerated, but it was happening before that. Most Americans and most people in the developed world have lost a lot of faith in mainstream institutions that we used to take kind of on face value, right? Like before COVID, for example, most Americans used to trust the CDC. They do no longer. Before COVID, a lot of people around the world used to trust the World Health Organization. They do no longer. A lot of people used to trust the rigor and the kind of truth and accuracy of things coming out of academic research in the social sciences. A lot of people no longer do because of the replication crisis in psychology and sociology, and because of high profile scandals of high profile researchers faking data, as well as the like very apparent ideological capture of some of these fields, therefore abrogating some of the rigor and the objectivity of the research. So as a result of that, there's no longer kind of an agreed upon list of sources, right? There's no longer an agreed upon thing, for the most part, that you and I can reference in conversation with people that won't sidetrack us into, well, the World Health Organization is actually a giant evil conspiracy theory of whatever, of the pharmaceutical companies, right? So I want to ask and discuss a little bit with you, Gabriel, how we maintain a high level of what I would call epistemic health. And I want you to define that for us as well. How we could maintain a high level of epistemic health while still being open to ideas that might sound outlandish, radical, or things that we might consider conspiracies traditionally, how do we kind of stay grounded, right? And I
Mhm.
ask this in part because I see this. You and I have seen this so many times. We've discussed this about mutual friends and or people that we both know, where they get disillusioned with mainstream institutions that they used to trust. And then they decide, well, I can't trust anything now. And so they just start believing whatever random stuff they read on the internet. And I'm not exaggerating there,
Yeah.
like just whatever random stuff they read on the internet. So, Gabriel, can you walk us through a little bit? Like, how do we think about conspiracy in a world of much lower trust in mainstream institutions, and how we remain epistemically healthy? And what I mean by that?
Yeah, so epistemic health, of course, has the root of epistemology, which is the philosophical study of knowledge and information. And so that's where we craft the idea of how do we know things? What does it mean to be a trusted source? So on and so forth. And there are, of course, many different theories of epistemology. There's, in some sense, you can put them on a scale ranging from like the radical skeptic who believes nothing is real, or maybe only believes his senses or something like that. On the other end of the spectrum, we have something like there's this Austrian theory of epistemological anarchism, which is this idea that there isn't really a hierarchy of epistemology and everything's valid to some degree, and you should investigate everything with this total like openness to every model possibly being true. In my perspective, there is a grounded epistemology, and there is kind of a correct and incorrect ways to approach it, though there may be contextual information that influences what level we're focusing on. But it's a big problem because the internet, again, a big part of the problem, has created a context where we have nearly endless information, which also means near endless misinformation, which also means that we have the capacity to question everything all of the time, which has a lot of strengths, but comes with the downside of breaking down any social trust. It's not that historically the government was trustworthy, but it was historically there were very few avenues for learning information, and so something like the government's research of disease was just something worth trusting because you didn't have very many options. And perhaps it was trustworthy in some contexts and it wasn't in others, but we now have this overabundance, and so you pretty much never have a reason to believe one source because there's endless sources. And this is amplified by the problem of having unlimited access and resources while not having personal lenses and personal trainings to understand how to evaluate information. You can Google anything and get the answer you want. If you were to Google right now something like coffee causes blindness, you would probably find an article that would suggest something like coffee can be harmful to your eyesight in the long run. But then 5 minutes later, if you Google coffee cures blindness, you'd probably find an article. And I'm literally genuinely encouraging the listener to do this exact thing. I almost guarantee that you will find an article that says the exact opposite. They'll say something like, ingesting coffee once a day will help your eyesight improve. Something along those lines. And that creates this very, very challenging context to do philosophy and to do politics and to do information in, because everyone has access to endless information and can constantly confirm any bias that they have. So it's important to ask yourself, how do I know if something is true? What is my methodology for experimenting and exploring ideas? And why do I think certain sources are trustworthy versus not trustworthy? You really got to challenge yourself to get serious about this if you want to be a genuine intellectual who has persuasive, interesting, true ideas.
That's absolutely right. And I want to piggyback off of that to share a few kind of rough and dirty heuristics I like to use to keep my epistemic health high, right? So the first thing is whenever you encounter a new piece of information, say a blog post, an article making a scientific claim, or a claim about anything really, uh, oftentimes you can sort these into, is this falsifiable or is it unfalsifiable? Okay. So a first heuristic I like to do is like, is this claim even falsifiable in the first place? And if it's not falsifiable, then maybe consider it, see if it conflicts with your priors or what else you know about the world. But there's not a lot to be done about those, and therefore I don't put a lot of stock in any unfalsifiable claims because by definition I can't prove if they're true or not. Two is seeking to disprove. This is a really important intellectual heuristic that you should develop, which is if you read something that to you is on either end of the spectrum, it's either self-evidently untrue to you, you're like that, there's no way that's accurate, Or on the other hand, you read it and you're like, well, of course that's accurate. I didn't even need to ask any questions about that. In both cases, it is important for you to attempt to falsify either one of those things, to try to find contrary evidence and learn what amounts to and what constitutes good evidence versus bad evidence, and what source the evidence comes from. Was it done through a randomized controlled trial that was pre-registered and published by in a peer-reviewed process through well-known institutions and well-known researchers? Or is it the claims of some random guy on Twitter that doesn't even have a citation to anything and he just says he saw it somewhere else once, right? We clearly need to put different amounts of stock, different amounts of trust, of confidence in different claims depending on where they came from and how you went about them. Another heuristic that I think helps a lot is as you learn, and this is almost circular, but bear with me for a second. The more you learn, the easier this gets. So the more you read from high quality sources that are well reasoned, the more you'll develop a kind of intuitive gut level sense of if something might be true or not. And that can often help guide you. Now, I hesitate to recommend this to everyone because it takes a long time to build up enough of a knowledge base to be able to do that, right? But the way this helps is as follows. Let's say I read a paper that says physicists have discovered how to build a warp drive, okay, how to skip across space, basically. My heuristic on that is immediately, this is probably a really bad popular science like misinterpretation of a fairly narrow physics finding, because I know, having read a bunch of physics, how much energy it would take and how difficult it is to fold a hole in the four-dimensional space-time and punch through it. So knowing that heuristic, because I know enough about just the basic laws of physics and how the universe is structured according to our most current understanding of physics, I immediately know that's probably not true. And usually in that case, I'll double click on it. I'll see what paper it came from, what research, and you'll find actually they're either A, the researchers didn't claim that, or B, this is a really like crappy finding that has not been peer reviewed yet. Somebody just threw it up on a website somewhere and it hasn't been replicated and it hasn't been validated. So getting a good handle on like the very basics of what is the scientific method, what constitutes good evidence, what doesn't. And then some of these heuristics I'm sharing here, again, like what is my knowledge base on this topic? Does this conflict with my priors on this topic? Does this comport with evidence that I know to be true on this topic? Can all help you and guide you through the process of navigating what is true and what is not. Now, let me add one more thing here, and then I want to get your heuristics and your reaction to this as well, Gabriel, which is I will be the first to admit this is not easy. Like this takes a lot of time. You have to read a lot. You have to try to learn a lot. And that didn't used to be the case. Now, for good or for ill, and there's nothing we can do to change that now that the internet's here, the burden is on you to learn enough to be able to develop a high level of epistemic health. And this is not easy. This is going to take you years to develop. And it's a thing you have to constantly refine. Like I'm refining this every day. Gabriel's refining this every day. And it's not easy at all. So I want to also tell you from the outset here, like I'm not saying like, oh, once you learn a few things and you just apply these heuristics, now you'll always know what's accurate and what's not. You won't. There are things I read to this day where I'm like, that seems really plausible. It fits in with my priors, but I'm not really sure. I can't find good evidence for or against it. And my personal epistemic status on that thing is I'm not really sure. There are convincing arguments in both directions. So it's important to learn to admit when you don't know something. And this is the last heuristic I'll share. Like admit when you don't know something. You need to be brutally honest with yourself and say when you know something enough about a topic to be able to judge it well, to understand it well, and when you don't, because you're only hurting yourself by pretending to know more than you in fact do, because it is preventing you from learning the truth. Because if you already think you know the truth, you're not going to be seeking out the truth. So I'll pause there, and I want to hear your thoughts on this as well, Gabriel.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. That intellectual honesty of being able to admit when you just don't know is so important. We live in an era, again, because of social media, where everyone feels like they have to have an opinion on everything. Take, for example, what's going on at the time of this recording with the Middle East, particularly Israel and the Palestinians. This is a conflict that concretely has gone on for 100 years, but abstractly has gone on for thousands of years, because theoretically the Jewish kingdoms were in that area before what we properly call Palestinians. And so theoretically, before Jesus was born, this conflict has been going on. Maybe step back and realize that your short-term opinion based off of just 100 years of information may not be the full picture. That doesn't mean you're wrong, but if you can acknowledge that, then you'll have the opportunity to have a more true opinion, or evaluate the facts from a more true kind of perspective and a broader perspective. So that's I think what you're saying is very important. I also want to add, you really should take some time to study logic. I really encourage listening to our podcast on logic or taking the course that I wrote, because the capacity to look at an article, look at a paragraph of information, and then translate it in your head, or perhaps even better, write down this translation and translate it into an argument with a structure where you can visually see this idea connects to this idea, which causes this idea and reaches this conclusion, is huge. Because when people communicate, there's a lot of rhetoric that can kind of obscure things. Someone can make a jump of logic and hide it in a joke. And you need to be able to filter out that information and translate. Literally, it's an act of translation. Translate it into a logical argument. And even better, again, if you can physically write that down. Try to pinpoint what are their premises and what is the conclusion, and see if you can write that down and put it into a logical structured argument so that you can evaluate it from that perspective instead of just trying to look at a paragraph and determine if it's true. So among everything you've said about understanding the scientific method and having intellectual honesty and thinking through trying to falsify stuff, all that's true. But I also really want to encourage people to study logic and learn how to translate things into argumentation, because that will save you a lot of time and a lot of grief and make it so much easier to read information and spot out when people are just using rhetoric to trick you.
Absolutely. And one last thing I'll add there, and then we will conclude this episode, is related to this concept of epistemic health, which is you need to effectively constantly be asking yourself the question, could I be wrong about this? And to realize and to try to fight against as strongly as possible the letting yourself fall into really black and white thinking. Now, I'm not saying there are not kind of black and white views on some issues. There certainly are. Like, not everything requires infinite nuance. But a lot of things, the harder you look at them, the more nuanced and less black and white and more shades of gray they become. And that is okay. And that is because reality is not black and white. Reality is a variety of shades of gray because of the infinite complexity of reality. So the last thing I'll share is I highly encourage each and every one of you to be asking yourself constantly, could I be wrong about this? And to constantly be on the lookout for you yourself to think about something in very, very kind of black and white terms. There are very few things that are black and white. Like, does gravity exist? That's black and white. Okay. I would even go so far as to say there are some political things that are pretty black and white, right? Like, we have enough evidence from attempts to apply it at this point to say communism on average and when applied leads to an inordinate, almost incomprehensible amount of human suffering, right? That's pretty black and white. There's not a lot of nuance there. But that's because there's an enormous amount of evidence on those things, and the outcomes are very, very clear from those evidence. They're very one-sided. But most other things are going to fall into some interesting shades of gray. The Israel-Palestine debate's a perfect example of this. Like, there's so much going on there and so much history that there's infinite nuance there, and there's so much nuance it's hard to even think about clearly. So I would just encourage everyone as well, as you're listening to Gabriel and I walk through these controversial topics, be asking yourselves, like, is this true? Could I be wrong about this? And could I be more nuanced about this? Or am I falling into the kind of retreat of black and white thinking? Our brains want to fall into black and white thinking because it's easy. It's a lazy way to do things, and it conserves mental energy. You can just render a judgment about something. You don't have to think about it again. But unfortunately, that's not how reality works. So I encourage everyone to try to cultivate that instinct as well. Do you have anything else to add on that, Gabriel?
No, I'm happy with that. And I'm really excited to dive into some of these controversial topics with you.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it, and it's going to be fun. So with that, we will break for the day. Thank you all so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment on this. And if you find this interesting and want to learn more about logic, about ethics, about anything at all, really, and want to support the podcast, please go to learnarena.com and go purchase a subscription. We'd love to have you on board. And after you do that, join our Discord as well, and we can talk about any of these things with you there in the Discord. So with that, thank you all so much, and have a great day.